As in our previous video, we started building some amount of intelligence to our Windows form. We added a click event such that when we fill out the information and select the type of car, click submit, then we get a message box displaying the data that was entered. Now in this video, what we want to do is add some more functionality or some more intelligence to the submission. We want to add some validation, things like maybe the customer name, and so we want to make sure that when the person clicks submit, the customer name and the car type, we need to make sure that values have been entered for customer name and selected for the car type. We also want to make sure that the dates are at least maybe the date returned should not be in the past or further in the past than date rented, things like that. So date rented can't have a future date when compared to date return. So we're going to add some intelligence for that. And we'll also look at potential exceptions that could occur while we are doing our operation. So to start this off, I'm going to modify my form a bit. And what I'm going to do is add a new field, and I'm going to call this field cost. So I'm going to go to my toolbox. I'm going to, the display, for some reason it hid my tools. So I know it's displaying many more than I need, but ultimately I right-clicked and clicked show all, and then it brought all of them. So if your toolbox or the selections inside of your toolbox disappear, you can right-click in the pane and click show all, or go to choose items and select the ones you want. Right now I'm interested in common controls because I'm about to bring over a new text box. So I drag it over, I get my arrow, that's fine. And I'm going to use this text box to allow the user to enter the cost. So I'm just taking the text box, I'm copying an existing label, so I don't have to do, cutting down the rework, changing the property, changing the text from customer name to cost. All right, so the expectation is that when the person is entering this record, they enter the customer name, the cost, the day rented, day returned, and the type of car. Now, I'm going to rename the text box. As we know, we have developed the discipline to do because I don't want to have to know if it's text box 1 or not. So using my naming convention, which is to put the prefix TB. So I'm going to say TB cost, all right? So I know I have a cost text box or a text box named cost or for the cost. So now I'm just going to modify my code. And to get the cost, I'm storing my cost as a double, all right? So I say double cost is equal to, and then it would be so easy to just say TB cost dot text, right? Because that's how we know we get the text from the text box. But here's a problem. We're seeing that we have a red line and it's saying it cannot implicitly convert type string to double. That's because text is a string and I'm trying to store the cost inside of a numeric data type, which we know is illegal because C# is so strongly typed. So I need to do a conversion. So I'm going to say convert dot to double. And then I'm passing in the value that is in the text box. So what this does is it gets the text from the text box, then it converts it to a double, and then we store it inside of our variable double cost. Now remember that we could actually just call these variables var if we wanted to. So if you want to change them out, that's fine. I won't do it, but at least we know the options that we have. Now, after adding the cost, what I'm going to do is add that data to the message box that's being printed. So I'm just going to duplicate one of the lines and change the text accordingly. Cost. So I Control D on this line will duplicate the line, and all I'm doing is changing out the data. So now cost is printed in my message box. Now, before I get to the message box, though, I want to make sure that all the data is available or is provided before it gets to this. So this should only get printed when everything is in place, everything is successfully entered into the form. So I need to check and make sure that the customer name is available and that the type of car, at the very least, those two should have been selected. So the tool I can use for this is a simple if statement. I can simply say if the string was provided, or if the value was provided, then, or if it wasn't provided rather, then there's an error. All right. So what I can say, and I love to check the negatives first in my code, I can say if customer name, right? And then if you have programming experience or from other languages, then maybe other languages would allow you to just say is equivalent to null. And that seems fine because what we're checking is to see if the customer name field, which we stored in the customer name field, which we stored in the variable customer name, we're checking if the value is null. That seems fine, but then if it is a blank string, then it's technically not null. So that comparison would not yield the result that we really want. So C# actually gives us some string manipulation tools. So I can call on the data type string, and then I can say dot, and then I will see that I have two functions here. I have one that says is null or empty, indicates whether the specified string is null or empty, or is null or white space, which indicates if it is null, empty, or consists of only white space characters, right? So I'm going to choose is null or white space. So you can choose either, but is null or white space seems a bit more comprehensive in terms of what we're checking. So I'm going to use is null or white space, then pass in the string that I'm checking to see if this string is null or contains white spaces or it's just empty. Whatever it is, that is supposed to return true or false, right? So I'm going to say if this is true, or if the car type also is null or empty. So I can say if either one of these is null or white space, let me use null or white space. So if either one of these is null or contains white space or is empty, then I want to display a message box that says, please provide missing data. Please enter missing data. All right. And then as you can see, I'm not, based on the fact that I'm checking for both of them at the same time, it limits my ability to be specific, right? So if I had an if statement or a condition for the customer name alone, then I could specifically say you're missing the customer name. If I had one for the car type alone, then I could specifically say you're missing the car type. The downside, however, is that I don't want to show a message box for every single error that is there. One message box that outlines all the errors would be nice, right? So right now, I'm just saying one message box with a generic error message based on the if either one of these conditions evaluates to true. All right. Another check that I indicated I wanted to do was on the dates, because I'm getting date in and I'm getting date out, or date out and date in. All right. So I want to make sure that the date out doesn't have a greater date value than date in, because that wouldn't make sense. It would make sense that I say the date rented is the 20th of February, but the date returned was the 1st of February. That's not practical, right? So that is illegal. So I'm going to add another if statement, and I'm going to say, so now I'm going to specifically check for this one and have a specific message box error for this. And then later we're going to refactor the code and make it a bit easier or a bit more efficient in displaying the error messages. But for now, let's just work on it the way, case by case. So I'm going to say if, and then these two are date values. So it's easy enough for you as a human to compare two dates. Is February 20 a greater date than February 1? And that would be true. February 20 is a greater date than February 1. So if we wanted to do this comparison, I could say if the date out is greater than the date in, then we have an error, right? So date out being the date rented should never be greater than the date in being the date returned. So I can say if date out is greater than date in, and then we display a message box saying illegal date selection. So let me just copy and paste that one and change the text. Illegal date selection. All right. But then you notice that I have a red line in my line 34 with this comparison. And that's because we're comparing two strings. It's saying you cannot use the greater than operator when comparing strings. So this greater than operator is usually used for numbers. Like if I want to check if one number is greater than the other, or if one numeric variable is greater in value than the other, then fine. But then I can't compare two strings, which then tells me that the way I'm handling my date values is inhibiting my ability to properly manipulate these values. So I'm going to go back, change up my code a bit. What I'm going to do is change these out to date time. So going back to our design, our date picker control actually returns a date time value by default, right? So I was the one trying to convert it to a string here, but the value itself, if we hover over value, you see that it says date time, and date time can be compared just like how integers and doubles and other numeric values can be compared. So what I'm going to do is change my code a bit, and I'm not going to convert it to a string. So instead, I'm getting the value, and then I'm getting an error because we're putting a date time inside of a string. So I need to change my data type. So now I'm just going to shortcut it and use var. All right. So var is going to make my variable take on the identity of the value being assigned to it. So I'm assigning a date time. So I hover over the variable, and all of a sudden it is a date time. All right. And notice that my error, it went right away. So I'm checking if this date time value is greater than this date time value. So date out should not be greater than date in. And if it is, then I'm going to display the illegal message. All right. The next thing that I'm going to do in terms of the logical flow is try and put something in place that it won't display the success message if these conditions are true. All right. Now, instinctively, you're probably going to say, oh, but we could have said if, then else if, and then else. And you wouldn't be wrong, but then I wouldn't write it that way. And I'm not going to write it that way, because when we have an if, then else if, then else, only one block can evaluate the true. So that means if we say if, then else if, then else, then we would only get to see one error message that is wrong with the form. So it's philosophical, right? I mean, there's no one way to do this, because you could do it that way. And you could say, if this is true, then nothing else executes. If this is false, else if this is true, then nothing else executes. And then if neither one of these evaluates the true, then the else would trigger, and then this would be true, and this would be displayed. However, I want to make it that I want to show the user everything that is wrong with the form when something is wrong with the form. So that's why I made this if statement, and then this message box will show, and then this if statement, this one will show also if both of these are wrong. But then I don't want this to show at all. So I'm just going to put in a new variable, and I'm going to call it var is valid, and I'm going to set this to true, right? So I'm declaring a Boolean called is valid, right? I'm calling it is valid. There's no particular reason for me naming it that way. It's just indicative of the fact that it is tracking if the form is in a valid state or not, right? So var is valid, and because I assigned the value true, it is a Boolean. Now, if this condition is true and we're going to display an error, then we know that the form is not valid, right? So I'm going to change the value of is valid. If the statement is true, then is valid is no longer true, right? So is valid is now equal to false. So once again, we start off by setting it as true. We want it to be true. We hope that this form is valid. But then we are going to check now for the invalid parameters. And the first of which is if the customer name or the car type was not provided, then we're going to say, well, it is not valid. If this was not met, then is valid is still true, because then if this condition wasn't met, then it didn't go in and change the valid state or value. But then if the date out is greater than the date in, then the form is not valid. So is valid is false here. All right. So both of these will check and say that, well, the is valid state is false. And then what I'm going to do in this last line is say if is valid is equivalent to true, then we want to proceed. All right. So then if is valid is true, then we print our success message. So I just put the success message inside of this if block. Now in C#, you can actually write this as if is valid. So you have two ways to write that. You can say, and let me just write a comment. You can say if is valid is equivalent to true. So you can write out the entire statement if it is true. But then when you're dealing with a Boolean, you're really saying if this is true, and then if you want to check if it's false, you can say if it is not true by just putting the exclamation sign instead of saying if is valid is equivalent to false. Right? So you can write it that shortcut way. That's a nice, cool way to write it. Most programming languages allow you to write it this way. And I'm just leaving this comment there so you can see exactly the alternatives you have. So if you feel more comfortable writing it this way, that's entirely fine. So let's go through this one more time. So we set a flag to check the validity of our form. I'm just saying is valid, is true. So when we collect all the information from the form, we're assuming that everything is intact and the validity is true. Then we start saying if the customer name is not provided or the car type is not provided, then the is valid is now false and we display the error message. We also check if the date out is greater than the date in. If that holds true, then it is invalid, and so we change the flag and display an error message. Now, at the end of all of that, we're checking to see if the is valid value is still true, because if neither of these conditions was met, then is valid is still true. And if is valid is still true, then we display our success. So as long as is valid's value didn't change from true until it got here, then it is success. All right, so let's test out our new logic. So we just click start, and then I'm going to fill out the form first. So I'm going to keep it, based on what we know. So I put in the customer name, I put in the cost, I put in the type of car, I click submit, and then it's going to say the illegal date selection. And that's because I'm checking that the date rented should be greater than the date returned. Right here, I didn't change the values and they're both defaulting to the same day. So if I make that adjustment, so we see that one of our validations is working, I click submit, and then we see that everything is okay. All right. Now let's start breaking it. If I change the date rented to the 5th and the date returned is the 3rd, or the date out is now greater than the date in, then when I click submit, illegal date selection. All right. So we're seeing that it is hitting this if statement. If we want to be more strategic in seeing exactly what the code is doing, we can add a breakpoint. So we're already in debug mode. We can go back to Visual Studio, add a breakpoint. So I'm going to add this breakpoint to the let's put it to the last variable declaration. All right. And then let's try this again. So I'm going to take out customer name this time. And then I'm going to click submit. And then what happens is that it hits that, and then using F11 you can go line by line. So when you see that line highlighted in yellow, it means that your breakpoint or your code execution is now at that line. If you hit F11, it will go to the next line, and then line by line you can track what's happening. So if I look in this variable, I see that it has no data, right? So customer name, blank string. If I look in car type, I see that Honda is provided. However, when I step through and I go to F11 again, it now goes into this if statement, because then this condition was just evaluated to be true. And so we're saying that the form is not valid, and then F11, and then it goes to the message box, and we see message box enter missing data. We click OK, but then the execution isn't done, and it continues, and we say F11, and then we see that the date out, which is the 5th of February, is greater than the date in, which is the 3rd of February. And if we F11, it goes in again, and it makes sure that it knows that the validity is false, and then it displays that message box again. So we have two message boxes being displayed, and then it continues. So F11, and then we go to is valid. Now, if is valid is checking if is valid is true, right? Right now it is false because if it wasn't set the first time, it was definitely set the second time. And so because it's false, it actually skips over that if statement and then continues. Now at this stage, we can just hit F5 for it to continue the execution, or we can just click continue. And so we would have gotten the two message boxes because we had two errors present. All right. So we see that our validation code is working. Just the same way, if I didn't provide a value for a type of car, we would have gotten that error message about entering missing data. Now, I'm going to run one more experiment and then show you another way that we need to code for validation. So I'm not going to provide a cost. All right, so no cost will be provided. And then I'm going to hit submit. And then you're going to see my code break right before your eyes. So we're getting some format exception where it's saying the input string was not in a correct format. All right, so what is happening here is that we did not provide a string for the cost, and then it is trying to convert it to double. So essentially, this is saying that I cannot convert nothing to a number. Yes, as a human, you're probably saying, but nothing as a number is zero. But the computer is seeing zero as something and nothing as literally nothing, right? So it is saying here that I cannot do this conversion. I don't know what to do here. And then these are what we call exceptions. So when we have an exception, it can break our program. And if I click continue, you see that it exits the program automatically, right? So when you're using your applications and you get those fatal errors and you click OK and then the entire program closes, those are exceptions. We want to reduce the number of exceptions or the likelihood that exceptions will occur and end the runtime or the running of our program. So we use exception handling because we code defensively to some extent and we might not be able to code defensively to a much further extent. So the TryCatch is literally the catch-all that helps us to navigate around those occurrences. So what I'm going to introduce to this button click event is a TryCatch. So going back to my first line, I'm going to say try. So I just write try, and then I'm going to press tab twice, and it generates the entire block for me. So I'm trying an operation, and then I'm catching an exception, right? So let me just start by taking everything that we were doing inside of this application, inside of this click event. So just the code that we wrote. So be careful with the braces. Just go to this last brace of this if statement. You cut that and then you put it inside of the try. All right. So we're trying all of these operations, and note it stopped executing on the 27th line or on the line where we're converting the text to double. So that is the problem line. It doesn't have to be a problem, but that's the one we've detected so far. The point is that I'm trying all of this. Wherever it fails in attempting any of this code, then we go over to the catch. So when one of those errors like we just saw with the conversion, when that kind of error occurs, then we catch it. We catch that error. Now I'm going to extend this catch and I'm going to put the exception into an object called EX, which allows me to get the details of the exception being thrown. So that error message that Visual Studio showed about invalid system error and this and that, I can actually get that wording from this object that I'm attaching to the exception, right? So then I can display a message box specifically inside of the exception. And then I can say that the exception or the message that I want to show is EX. So that's the object for the exception, dot, and then it has message. All right. So then I can display the message saying that, this is the problem that you're encountering. The throw would actually end the program. Now you can make a decision. Do you want to end the program when there's an exception, or do you want to continue the program even though there's an exception? So I can just remove the throw. I'll comment it out for now, but you can delete it if you want. But the throw, once again, will end the program. If you don't have the throw, it will display the message box. You click OK, but then you still have your program running. So let's see how that works. So I go back to start. And then this time I want to test and make sure that my exception handling works. So I'm going to provide the data that I know needs to be provided, change the date, and then click submit. And then you see input string was not in a correct format. So what happened was it tried the operation, it got up to the part where it tried the conversion, and then it realized that, okay, I can't do this. It went down to catch the exception, and then that is the message inside of the exception, because we didn't type anything in a message box to say this, right? So this message box is displaying the message for that particular exception. So you see, even though we can code defensively against fields that we're expecting or conditions that we're expecting, business rules that we're enforcing, sometimes the system itself may have an error that you could not have accounted for. So that is where the TryCatch comes in handy, and we can catch certain exceptions and not let them end the program, completely. Now, as a final act, I'm just going to modify the way we're displaying the message boxes. All right. So instead of displaying a message box per error, what I'm going to do is have a string where I'm going to compile the errors, and then if is valid is false, then we display that message box with all the compiled sentences of errors. So right now we have two error situations. We have this one and we have this one. We have two message boxes. What I'm going to do is declare a new variable, var error message, but I'm making this one equal to an empty string. So I'm starting off with an empty error message because up until this point, we're assuming that the form is valid, right? And then the error message would be empty. So instead of saying error message box dot show, I'm going to say instead error message, and then we can do a little operation here where we say plus equals, right? So we are just saying we're compiling the string, all right? So we're saying error message plus equals, please enter missing data. And then I'm just going to add the new line operator right there, right? So in case there are multiple lines that will be there, I don't want all the lines. So I can refine this a bit. So I can say error, please enter missing data. So if the customer name and the car type are not provided, then I say the validity of the form is now false, and then I'm adding an error message to the variable that I already created, right? So it starts off blank, and then if this is true, then now it has some content. So I'm saying whatever was there before, add this string to whatever was there before. That's what the plus equal. It's an accumulation, right? So we'll probably be used to this with math. Well, in C# you can use it against strings also. So I'm going to do the same thing down below. I'm going to say if the date out is greater than the date in, then I also want to accumulate this error message onto the string. So I'm just going to take this new line character, put it into the string, take out this extra brace. And so if either one of these or if both of them are successful, then we're just compiling the error message, and the is valid would have changed anyway. Now, I can put in that if else down here to say if is valid, then display a message box with the success. And then I'm going to say else I want a message box. So message box.show, and then I am going to display the error message. Whatever the contents of error message are up until this point, I want to print them out inside of the message box. So that means if you add another scenario tomorrow where you have another if statement for the validity, then I can just add error message and say what is wrong. So let me I forgot to put in the word error there. All right. So I'm just showing you that there are so many ways you can do this. I'm not saying this is the way to do it. I'm not saying this is a standard. I'm not saying that this is, there's no other way. I want you to have your individuality. Sure. I'm just showing you that there are so many ways to do this. Once you accomplish what you need to do, and with maybe fewer lines of code, the jury's out on whether fewer lines of code means more efficient or not. But the fact is, if you can accomplish it, then that's good. So let us test and see what this would look like. So if I start the application, all right, and then I submit. So what will happen when I submit is that it's going to bomb out on this line. So if I submit with everything blank, it tries to convert the empty string to cost, and then it's just going to catch the error. So when I click submit, you see it jumps straight to the catch and is displaying that error. So that's fine. But let's provide a cost, and then let's try again. If I click submit, now it's saying object not set to instance of an object reference not set to an instance of an object, which I can tell you we didn't write that error, so that's another exception. So now we need to debug and see exactly what we're missing, why we're getting that error. So if I put my breakpoint at the start of the line, so all I did was minimize, put my breakpoint, and now I'm bringing back up my window, and I click submit. So I'm going to step through until I see where it jumps out. So as far as you can see, once it goes to the next line, everything is okay, right? So it's going to the next line, and then I think it's this line. It's saying that the object reference is not set to anything. So I'm here trying to convert nothing to string, right? So the selected item is null, and I'm trying to convert null to string, and then I am guaranteeing you that when I press 11, it's going to go straight down to the catch. And there we go, all right? So then that's another thing that we didn't account for, right? So that means we need to kind of change the way that we're getting the value from the combo box. So another way to get the value from the combo box could be the dot text. So I'll use the dot text. So dot text would get the value from the combo box. And I made a code change while I'm in debug mode. So I actually have to restart the application, all right? So dot text would give me the text that is being displayed in the combo box. If there is no text being displayed, then it's a blank string. That is safer, as we're seeing. If we try the way that we had it before, we're going to get an exception, and we might not be able to properly tell the person, sorry about that, we might not be able to properly tell the person what's wrong. So using the dot text is probably easier. So let me just restart this application. And once again, we restarted because if we make a code change while we're in debug mode, it doesn't register. And to restart, all I did was click this circular arrow beside the stop button and pause buttons, all right? So let's try this again. So I'm going to change the cost. We saw that the cost validation worked. It jumped to the exception. And then I'm going to click submit. But before I do that, let me take out my breakpoint because I don't want the breakpoint. I don't want to have to step through. So taking out the breakpoint, I'm clicking submit, and then we're seeing our message box with our errors. Error, please enter missing data. Error, illegal date selection, all right? If I change one of them, so I put in the customer name and click submit, then I'm only going to see, oh, well, it's still saying enter missing data. So that's another thing to it, because I'm checking for both customer name and type of car in the same if statement. It's hard to be individual, right? So I mean, I could probably miss it, fill it out and say, please enter customer name and the type of car. I could be explicit. So obviously, if I have one and not the other, then the user could deduce. So that's fine. You could change the message, or you could change the number of if blocks. I won't prioritize that right now, but let me just produce the type of car, click submit, and then we're seeing one error message now saying illegal date selection, and then we change that to 3, and then we click submit, and now we have a valid form and valid data being inserted. All right, so that's pretty much it for building in some validations. Once again, this is not an exact science. This is not an exact, like, this is the way it has to be done. This is just a guide giving you some ideas as to how you could go about validating, what you need to look out for, how to properly handle when there are genuine errors that you have not accounted for without ending the runtime of your program.